Okay, the number of people logging in has slowed down a little bit, so let's get started. So again, welcome to part 2 of our 4-part series on business intelligence, concepts, and Excel tools, subtitled, Get, Transform, and Visualize Your Data to Drive Performance. I'm David Warsnick. I'm a senior consultant at CCSI, and I'll be working with you over the next 3 sessions on some of the tools that we started looking at last time. So today is part 2. We're going to take a look, and I'm going to demo the functionality inside of Excel that used to be called Power Query, that now is currently in the system called Get and Transform Your Data. So this is a 4-part series. We did our fundamentals last week, or 2 weeks ago. This week we're doing our Get and Transform Your Data. Next Wednesday, November 7th, we'll do data models and data visualizations. And then on Tuesday, November 13th, we'll be holding an office hours where I'll be able to take a look at specific questions that you may have, maybe demo a few other things in a little bit greater detail for those of you that are interested. So the learning objectives, to go through it real quickly, we looked at this last time. We started by gaining a better understanding of some of the concepts related to business intelligence. Again, taking a look at some of the functionality in Excel, pivot tables, pivot charts, Power Query, Power Pivot, and the data analytic expressions. Again, today we're going to focus on Power Query to get and transform your data. And we're going to witness how the functionality can be applied to your organization. I don't need to go through the challenges. We all know what our challenges are. Data, data, data. Everybody needs information. Everybody needs it analyzed. Everybody needs it available to individuals in our organizations who need to use the data and to improve quality, make decisions, and to really have a robust data environment and a data analytic environment. We need to be able to pull data from multiple sources, synthesize it, and deploy it, and make it available for individuals. The need for that has increased exponentially over the last couple of years, and there really is no end in sight. I talked with people about where to start. Really need to create a standard strategy, business intelligence strategy, which includes how you're going to gather your data, how you're going to store it, what kind of tools you're going to use, how you're going to analyze your data, and then how you're going to provide it to your end users. The second piece in my recommendation is leverage your current resources. That's why we're looking explicitly at the Excel tools. Excel has built in some significant functionality in their current environment, including the tools that we're going to be looking at today. And you need to create a data-informed environment by providing information to your end users by embracing the concept of self-service analytics. So, what is business intelligence? This is the definition that I like best. It's the term that refers to skills, processes, technologies, and applications used to support evidence-based decision-making in an organization. And it really can be defined as approaches for gathering, storing, analyzing, and providing data. Today we're going to look explicitly at the gathering features of the Get and Transform Your Data. So as I said, business intelligence, we need to gather our data. We need to get and transform it. We'll be looking at that today. And then we need to begin data models. Data models are a way of bringing your data into a repository, joining it with other data, building measures and key performance indicators, and then building your visualizations off of that. we will be taking a much closer look at the data modeling capabilities in our next session next week. This is sort of a really little bit of an idea. You have your external data sources. You're going to connect to them through some kind of functionality. Today we'll talk about get and transform. That get and transform data then moves to your Powerpivot, which is your data model. And then in a very simple example, we can use pivot tables and pivot charts in Excel to deploy and visualize our data. So today we're going to do the demonstration of get and transform. So I'm going to take 1 second here. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start looking at Excel. So let's get started here. So the first thing that I want to take a look at is the data that we're going to be using for this demonstration, and the data that we'll be connecting to so I can demo the functionality. So again, this is all demonstration data. There are no, although the dates and the services and the CPT codes are consistent with what your data may look like. You'll see we have no client names. These client numbers are generated randomly, and the staff names that we're going to be looking at were also generated randomly. If you take a look at this, this is an example of data that you could probably get off of any billing system. We have our staff data, our program data. You see our staff data is coded in our data set. We have 6 staff. Just looking at a table of data. I have 2 programs in here. We have dates from January 2018 through the end of August. I have start times and end times on my services, a service code, a service, CPT codes. I have a blank data element here for units, client numbers, client names. I've got revenues, paid, net, and current billing, and some open fields. We're not going to be taking a look at the revenue data today, but one of the things that I always do when we create data exports off of systems, in this case, we created a data export for a productivity analysis. But we have other data in our EHR. You may have a standardized report. As you see here, you can pull down data that is related to billing, what was billed, what was paid, what was AR. So I don't restrict the data from my export. We can restrict those data elements as we move forward and get in transform, because I may be wanting to look at productivity now, but then there's ultimately going to be additional questions. And those questions are going to be related to payers, payer mixes, reimbursement by payer, a whole number of questions that can be answered. So when you think about bringing your data in, don't worry about bringing too much in, because some of these structures that we build can just be replicated for different purposes. So the first step, and this is a little bit off from the topic, but the first step that I always go through is to vet my raw data. If this is data that I looked at for the first time, I always take some time in the beginning to acquaint myself with the data, the structure, and ask myself a question of whether the data is complete, and can I actually use all the data elements that I brought forward. That is, you'd be surprised how many times you'll bring a data set in and you'll find that there's holes in your data. Certain data elements may have been filled in incorrectly, and some of the elements that you want to use are unusable. So I'm going to show you a really quick and dirty way of going through the process that I go through to take a look at data. The first thing I do is take a look at where I have holes in my data. So you'll look, I have a start time here and an end time, but now I have data elements where I have a blank end time. That leads me to question whether this end time data is really usable data. My plan is to create a duration calculation based upon the end time of a service and the start time of a service, because what I'm going to be evaluated is the amount of time my individual clinicians spend in direct services as compared to what's expected of them. So if I have holes in my end time, that data is not going to be usable, and I'll have to go find other data sets. The simplest way I have found to do this is go to your filtering, unselect all, and then select your blanks, because those are the only ones that I'm interested in. So I'm going to select my blanks. You'll see I have a number of rows here that have a blank end time. So I'm going to then go into my service description and do a drop down here and say, okay, the services that I don't have end times are for canceled, notes, no-shows. So there's no services here that I'm concerned about as part of my productivity analysis. So that quick analysis has showed me that having a blank in the end time is just fine. So I also have blanks in my CPT code. Now you could assume that looking at this first transaction, I have a blank end time, I have a canceled appointment, so I wouldn't have a CPT code. I never assume that the blank data in a column is related to blank data in another column. It just takes a second to go in and verify and make sure that you're looking at what you think you're looking at. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take a look at my blanks, do my drop down, and again, same visits, canceled, contact notes, no show. So I'm good to go. I'm going to then clear my filters, and I know there's nothing in units. Let's make sure that I don't have any blanks in clients, so I've got all my client data. The other thing I'm going to do is take a look at my billing and say, okay, let's take a look at the blanks in our billing. There's only a handful of them. Now you look here, and I have blanks in my payer, but I also have services. So this is an area where you have to ask yourself, is this a significant enough of transactions that would make any difference to your analysis? And you'll see there's just a handful of visits that don't have a payer. So I'm going to feel comfortable with going forward and using the payer data. We won't be using that today. We'll look at that next week, but I feel comfortable using the payer data. So going through, taking a look at your data, making sure that you have a good, solid data set. Worst case scenario, you're making decisions based upon poor data. So let's go into our demonstration. You'll see here this is Excel 2016. If you're familiar with Excel and you go to data, you're going to see over in your left-hand menu this new menu structure around Power Query or Get and Transform Your Data. This is where the functionality is going to live for us to connect to our data sources and transform our data. So let's take a look at some of the functionality that we have in here. The first icon allows us to connect to our data. You'll see we can connect to files, which workbooks, CSVs, folders, SharePoint folders. We can connect to databases. All these, you can connect natively to these databases. They give you a fairly robust set of databases that you connect to. You can connect to online services, other sources, and we'll take a look at combined queries. So we have a number of different ways of connecting to our data. You'll see that some of the functionality here is just repetition. I can get to a text in CSV through my get data. I can go to the web from my get data. But if you have functionality or different types of data that you connect to automatically, you won't have to go to the get data. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to a data source. I'm going to connect to a file, and I'm going to connect to a workbook. And the workbook that I'm going to connect to is the data demo data file that we were just looking at. So I'm going to connect to that file. It's my data file. And you'll see that the first thing that's going to happen here is I had a number of different tabs in that file. So what it's going to do, this dialog box is going to show me all the different tabs that are available to me in that workbook, and the one that I'm going to select, I know, is my data file. The first thing you'll notice is once you connect, you get this little snapshot of what your data looks like. That's extremely helpful. I know that now I'm connected to the proper tab. If I connected to this one, say, no, that's not what I want. That's my date file, so let's connect over here. So at this point, you can do one of three things. You can cancel out, you can edit the query, or you can load the query. We're going to go to edit, and I'm going to keep the load conversation to a little bit later in the presentation. So what it's doing, it's evaluating my data. It's going to pull it up in a different window. I'm going to bring this over. And now let's notice a couple of changes that have occurred here. So let's start over in the upper right-hand corner. The first thing that it did is it created a name for my query. It used the name of the spreadsheet tab that my data was in, and so the name of my query is Data T. I can change that, I can leave that, I can do whatever I want. You'll notice across the top now you have an entire set of menus. You have a home menu, transform, add column, and view, and we'll go through some of this functionality in a second. The other thing that you'll find over here, and this is really where you'll be doing a lot of your work, is what is called applied steps. Let's take a little bit closer look at applied steps. So the first thing is that we connected to our data, and so you'll see over in my applied step, I have a little gear next to source. This was the first step. The first step is a set of instructions for this query to connect to my data source. We can see those instructions right here in this formula box. Get and transform uses a formula language called M. I'm not sure why it's called M. It's a case-sensitive scripting language that is used exclusively by query, though you don't necessarily need to know the language to understand that this is the data source that I connected to. The second is navigation, and the navigation tells us which tab in the spreadsheet I connected to. And the third thing that happens is changed values. What the query language does is it goes through, it takes a look at each of your data elements, and it guesses on how it needs to change the formats on each data field and how to make them more useful. My recommendation to you is you always go through and take a look at how Get and Transform has changed the format of your data set. You can do that in one of two ways. One of the ways is you can drop down and take a look at the M language and go through each of the data fields. Here's an example program was changed to a text type. Date was changed to a date. The other simplest way of doing this, to take a look, you see an icon against it within each of the column headers. So staff is now ABC, meaning it's alpha. The date has a little calendar next to it, so it's date. But my start time, because it had date time along with times, query wasn't absolutely certain. It was confused. It didn't know whether it should be a date field, a date time field, or a time field. So it defaulted to alphanumeric. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to change this because, again, I want to calculate a duration. So I need to understand the difference between the end time and the start time, and I really can't do that with an alphanumeric data source. So what I'm going to go through is there is two places to change your data site. There's a lot of redundancies in here. I can either go into transform and change my data site, or I can stay right on my home. I'm going to select the column, because a lot of the functionality will be will understand the context or the element that you want to change. So in this case, I'm going to choose start time. I'm going to go to my drop down here, and I'm going to pick time. You'll see that that was transformed now. So now I have a time measure. It took my date and time fields, and it stripped out the date and showed it just as a time. You'll see over on the right-hand side here that it did not add another step because it is just part of the step that the query is doing to change. And you'll see that now start time up here is a time function. So the second piece, again, my end time, I have to do the same thing. I'm going to go in, I'm going to do my transform. I'm going to change that to a time. So let's take a look at everything else. Service is fine. That's an alpha field. Service description is an alpha field. My CPT is alphanumeric. That's because the CPTs are, in fact, an alphanumeric field. My units is null. I have nothing in there. My client numbers. So I'm looking pretty good. So I have successfully made some minor changes to my data and changed the format. So now all the formats are in a format that I can use and begin bringing it into my model to analyze my data. So let's walk through some of the other functionality in the Home tab. So I said that, everything is written in M. There's an advanced editor. Every once in a while, when you get into more complicated queries, you may have to write a little bit of code. I have found that to be very infrequent. I think the point-and-click interface will get you in the most places that you need to go. So I was saying before, don't worry about bringing too much data into your analysis because you can clean up your data very easily. One of the ways to do that is to choose the columns that you want in your data set. So you can do a drop down and you can choose and you can just go through and check the columns you want. And if you know all of your column names, then this is an easy way to do it. But sometimes if you have a lot of columns, it's just as easy to do it this way. Which I'm going to do is let's get rid of some of these. So I'm going to click on units. Then I'm going to press my control key and select client names. And then let's do one more. I'm going to select and do open one, which is a blank field. So I've selected these columns. Now I'm just going to do remove columns. and your columns are out of your data set. It's important to understand right now there is absolutely no data inside my Excel. All I'm looking at is the application of a set of instructions that is being followed by Get and Transform here in Excel to change my data. You will see that we added another step, which was remove columns. There's no gear on here, so I can't tell through here which columns I removed. But again, if I go up to my M coding, you'll see table, remove columns, units, client name, open one. There's always a methodology for you to be able to determine and find out what changes have been made. So let's go through and see what else we have. You can keep rows, you can remove rows. So we can keep just top rows, say you only wanted the top 10 rows for some reason, or a range of rows. And this really, I found I've used keep rows and remove rows very infrequently, particularly when I'm looking at large data sets, but there certainly could be periods where you'll need to keep or remove some of your roles. You can change your sort. The other thing, you'll see some of the text functionality that you have inside of some of your formulas in Excel. So let's take a look at split column. I'm going to choose my column again because the menu item I pick, I want it to work against this column. I'm going to split a column, and you'll see that in that column I have commas separating the different data elements. So I'm going to split by a delimiter, and my delimiter in this case is a comma. And I'm going to say OK, and it's going to create new fields that has split the original field up into four separate columns. Very useful when you have data, multiple different data elements within a single field. In this case, if I wanted to break out primary, secondary, and tertiary pairs, I could do it that way. But for the purpose of what I'm working on today, I really don't need that column split. So this query has a wonderful way of backing out something that you don't want, and you'll see that this new change type and split column by delimiter were added. So all I need to do is remove those, and I'm back where I'm started. I actually think this is a wonderful feature because I take a look at data in different ways. I split it up. I can use this to vet some of my data, and if I make a mistake or I go down a path that I really don't want, it's very easy for me to remove and get back to where I was. So we could do a group by. So let's take a look at here my service description, and let's do a quick where did my group by, and I'm going to group by the column by service description. I'm going to count them, and I'm going to say OK. And this looks very much like a pivot table. So one of the things you can do is you may have a large data set you may want to bring in, but you really only want to work off of aggregate data. So you could use your group by to aggregate your data. Again, in this case, I'm really not interested in a group by, so I'm going to take that out. So we do group by. As we saw, we can change our types. Sometimes you have use first row as headers. Many times when you bring CSV or text-based data in, Excel doesn't recognize the first row as a header, so you need to promote your first row as headers. The other one functionality that I've ended up using from time to time is this replace value. Sometimes you may have a data field that is numeric but has zeros, and when it comes in, get and query reads those zeros as null or blank fields. You may want to do some arithmetic functions against the numbers in that field. So you would need to, the null does not work in your arithmetic function. So let's do something as simple. Actually, I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to pick null within this column. I'm going to say replace values. Value defined as null, replace with 0. And I'm going to say OK. And you'll see now that all those null fields got replaced with 0. This is important functionality, particularly as it relates to your numeric fields that may have null values in them. Again, let's take that out. And we're going to take a look at merge and append queries in a second. I did have a question come in. It said the question is, do these columns remain removed when you update the data sources, meaning that when you run this report again next week? Yes, absolutely. And because what we are creating here is a set of instructions. So every time you refresh your query, it's going to go out, connect to the data source all over again, and follow the instructions that we're setting up in the query. So you build your query once, and then you update your data source. So as an example, I'm looking at transactional data through the end of August. Once September is closed, I'm going to go to my data source. I'm going to add my September data. I'm going to come in and query. I'm going to refresh it. The same steps will be followed, but now I'll have data through the end of September. That's a very good question, but you'll see the same format, and the rules that you apply will remain every time you update the query. So those are the primary functionalities inside of the Home tab. So you get the idea of why they started calling it Get and Transform, because we're really getting our data and now we're transforming it. So when we get into Transform, there's some additional functionality that we get to look at here for transforming your data. So some of these we saw, Group By we saw over in Home, use your first row as header we saw as Home, transform some of our data, changing your data types. Simple things, if you wanted to say change the name of your column, you can do rename. That's simple stuff. We did fill, we did replace values, and split columns. So you'll see that there's not a tremendous more functionality that lives in the Transform than that lives in the Home. But there are a couple of filtering techniques that I think that I want to show you that can be helpful. So you see over in the far right-hand corner, we have this date and time columns. So if I go to a date field, suddenly you'll see that the date is no longer grayed out, and now I have some functionality or some filtering functionality that I can apply to my data set. So one of the interesting things is how many times have you brought down date of birth and needed to know somebody's age and had to create a formula to do that. In this case, all you do is click age, and it's going to calculate your age for you. Now, these are all current dates, so it really doesn't make any sense in this example and scenario, but you can go through and you can pull out just the year as an example, and So you may just need to want to know what the year is, and so you'll see it changes my date to year. So there is some additional functionality inside of your date fields, quarters, weeks, days, earliest, latest. So I find this to be interesting. So let's do that on the start time. So let's go over to start. Now you'll see time has additional functionality related to it. So if you have a date and a time field, you can use time only. That'll strip out the date. But one of the things that I like is to further vet my data. So let's go into here and let's see where the earliest is. And I had a transaction in my data set that supposedly went off at 3:30 a.m. Unlikely that that's the case. So I have some time fields in there that don't make any sense. So let's take a look at start time and go back to our transform and our time, and let's take a look at the latest. So 9:30 p.m., well, that's probably reasonable. Maybe it was an emergency visit. But the point I'm trying to make is you can continue to use some of this filtering functionality to continue to vet your data. What I would do is I'd go in and grab the transaction of my start time. Let's try to do it this way. Let's do a time filter, and let's pick is earliest. So in this case, I'm able to go in and pick a transaction that had a start time of 3:30 a.m. and an end time of 4 p.m. Classic input error in start time, and because you'll be able to find transactions that don't make any sense. And in this case, this was an input error. Now, in most cases, when you're looking at a large amount of data, and in this case, I'm looking at about 7,000 rows, one data field may not make a huge difference. But what we're going to find out is that in this case, it probably will, because I'm going to have a duration for this service that is going to be all out of whack. So let's talk about this other. So what I have here in my data set, I have a start time and an end time, but what I want to be able to do is generate a duration. Because again, what my productivity measures is the amount of time spent in providing direct clinical care versus the expectation for individual staffs. So what I need to do is I need to calculate the time between the end time and the start time. And that is something that's actually very easy to do. There's some additional functionality in here that you can do conditional columns. So I could build a column with a condition, such as I can pick a column name, let's say staff, my operator equals. I could put a value in there, and then you can get a column that is actually an if or statement. It's a conditional column. So you can create columns of data based upon conditions. The other piece then, let's just do a quick custom column here. You're going to get a dialog box. You'll see you're able to put a name in. Let's call that duration. And then I'm going to build a small calculator. It's a calculation here. It's already picked the equal sign as the beginning of the calculation. So I'm going to do end time minus start time. All right. You'll see it's showing me down here in the lower left-hand box that I have no syntax errors detected. So I'm going to say OK. It's going to create a value. You'll see I've got 15s and 45s, but it's in sort of a strange kind of a format here. And the other thing that I know is so what I'm going to do is let's go in and let's do a transform, and let's change this to a whole number and see what we get. Yeah, we're getting some really funky data in here. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to change my formula, because what I do know is that a formula like this is what I sometimes need to do, is to multiply it times the number of seconds in the day. I'm going to say OK with that. And then I'm going to go back in here and change my type. And you'll see now I have a duration, 45, 45, 45, 30. So I've created a column with my duration in it. What we were looking at before is a possibility that I have some really funky numbers in here. So one of the things that I may want to do is do the drop down and say, okay, what are some? I have a duration in here of minus 1125. I have a duration of 930, and I have durations of 750 and 765. I want to go take a look at those, and you'll see that if I'm doing a duration calculation on an individual, I can't really deal with the fact, it's just going to throw somebody's calculation out the window. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to clear my filter, and instead of picking the ones that I want, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to keep all of them, but what I'm going to do is take out these. So I'm adding another set of instructions to take those out. I filtered that row. Now I feel reasonably comfortable that I have good durations. Now I threw out 4 transactions. That's fine. That's probably not going to make a huge amount of difference, but I can't have a minus 1100 as part of my duration, else nothing will work here. So now let's talk about our load, because this is an important piece. So right now this doesn't live anywhere. It's a set of instructions. It's showing me how the data will be rendered through this set of instructions. So now I have to bring the data into my Excel spreadsheet. There's 2 ways of doing that. I can close and load, and as a default, what it will do, it will bring my data in as a table in Excel. What I like to do in most cases is to do close and load, which then gives me these set of options. So for this example, I'm only going to create a connection, and I'm going to bring this data into my data model. So let's say OK. It's going to load the data. You're going to see that I've got 7,400 rows loaded. You'll see in my sheet I have no data in my sheet, but I do have data in my Excel spreadsheet, and that's living in my data model, which we're going to take a look at next week. So here you see my data table. It's got the information. It has the rows I selected. It has the columns I selected. It has my duration column in it, and it's living in my Excel, but it's in the back end in my data model. The nice thing about this, though, is if I were going to go insert a pivot table and see what happens here, what is available to me is all the fields in my data model. I do not need that data in a table in my Excel because I'm building a visualization from here. I want the data to be in the back end, and that data is now available to me whenever I need it. And once I do a refresh, it will be updated, and I'll be looking at the most current data. So let's go back into here, and let's take a real quick look at one of the other functional areas in here that is really important. So let's go up in here, and let's hover over. You'll see the parameters around your query. I'm going to do an edit. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually close this. I'm going to create another real quick query. So I'm going to go get my data. I'm going to do it from a file. I'm going to do it for a workbook. I'm going to go back and connect to my data file that I did before. But this time, I'm going to connect to my staff list. The reason I'm connecting to my staff list is because my data set has an ST1, ST2 for my staff IDs and no name. I'm doing self-service analytics. I don't want everybody to try to memorize what my staff IDs are. So I'm going to go and load that up into my model. And I'm going to add it to my data model, build only a connection, and say OK. So if we hopped over our data model real quick, you'll now see that I have two tables. I have my staff, I have my transactional data, I have my staff ID data. And what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to go and I'm going to take these two, I'm going to get my data, and I'm going to combine these two in a merge. I'm going to move relatively quickly. I'm going to pick my primary data field, my data table, and the field that I want. I'm going to pick my secondary field and the table that I want. Don't certainly have time to talk about join kinds, but those who do data joins, you have all of your selections left out or right out, or very helpful. So I'm going to build an OK. And then what we're going to have is a new data source, my original table plus this column that says staff. There's these two little bursting arrows here, probably hard to see. But under this scenario, then I can open this up and I can tell it which fields from my secondary table I want brought into my primary table. I already have the ID. I don't really care about the unit or the program, but I want staff name. So I'm going to say OK. So you'll see now in my data set, every time it found a code ST1, it put the staff's name into my file. So now when I do a pivot table, so let's decide what we want to do. Let's close and load this. Let's create a connection. Let's load it to my data model. It's going to be called Merge 1. I should have probably changed that, but we'll leave that as Merge 1 for now. So now I can go and I can insert my pivot table. And I can now take my Merge 1 and I can pick up by staff name. And then any of the other fields. You can pick up duration, this is in minutes, or say service description and put it underneath here. So as you see, we begin building this environment where I don't have to know who ST1 is. I'm able to know that the individual's name for that. So the final step we can do, and I hope this demonstrates a little bit more of how this is structured. So if we go into my data model, I now have 3 tables. I have my original date table, I have my staff crosswalk table, and I have the merge data that has my staff names in it. But I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. So I'm going to hover over my date table because this is redundant data now. So I'm going to change the close and load. I'm not going to add it to the data model. I'm only going to have a connection. So it's going to prompt me. I'm going to say, okay, I understand. It's going to pull the data out of the data model. I'm going to do the same thing with edit, with the staff table. We'll add that. We'll change the close and load on this. We'll just create the connection. We're okay. I'm going to say okay, and I'm going to jump over here, and we're going to have now a single table that I've transformed. I've connected to my data source. I chose the columns that I wanted to choose. I filtered off the rows that were giving me poor data. I merged this with another data source to get my staff names into my analysis. And I sent that to my data model along with a calculation of duration in minutes. So now the model is ready for me to start doing my data analysis and data visualizations, and those will be topics for next session. So I've got a couple questions, but before we get to that, I did just want to remind people that the process that we went through is in no means for you to look at this 45 minutes worth of me running around the screen and be able to use this functionality. Now, to be fair, there's probably a bunch of you out there who are familiar with query languages, know how to do data joins, knows how to understand how to vet data. You can pick up and start using this tool intuitively, and I will guarantee you'll be able to do that. Next week, once we get into our data modeling, KPIs, and data analytic expressions, we'll be really diving more into the really, I think, fairly robust functionality that we have in here. So let's answer a couple quick questions, and if you have any more questions in the time that we have available, please feel free to chat those in. I've missed it, but does Excel 2010 have Power Query function? Excel 2010 has Power Query as an add-in. So if you went to your options, normally down here you have add-ins, and Power Query is Excel is a COM add-in. Very easy. Go on and Google Power Query for Excel 2010, and it'll show you how to add to it. Powerpivot is also an add-in. I would highly recommend this, that if you are going to start doing data analysis, if you're going to use the query tools and the data modeling, I would very much suggest that you get a license for Excel 2016. The reason I say that is that what we do see is that Excel and Microsoft are updating functionality in 2016, particularly the 365 version of Excel 16. They're updating these tools every single month. So you get the newest functionality, and you bring more power to your desktop. So it's my recommendation that you go to 2016. You don't have to, If you have an earlier version, you'll need to bring them in as add-ins. Second question, can the position of the added column be changed or the position determined at the start of the process or by adding a column? You can certainly change, positions of any of your columns if you want to. Let's see, let's go to our merge. Let's see if we can go to edit. I don't normally do that, so let's see where I could find that. So if I said, if I picked a column, let's say we had a duration column. Let's see if I can just drag it. Oh, there you go. Just drag it, and you move it. So your column positions are totally set by yourself, and you can move them around and do whatever you'd like. Let's see. I have a comment. Let's go and see if we've got, that's not what I want. Let's stop sharing my screen. See if we have other questions that came in. So I do have 3 minutes left. So do you have a standard return on investment summary I can use for the purchase of the updated license? I'm 2010. No, we don't. We don't have an updated ROI summary. I think that if you take a look at the not-for-profit pricing, in that you could probably get a license for 2016 relatively inexpensively. I think particularly if you're going to start doing some development, teach yourself how to use the tools, starting with just a couple licenses for your developers over a period of time. I think that once you're able to more clearly understand the functionality that you have, the value that you bring to your organization, the ability to do your data visualizations, then I think that you'll probably be able to make a good case without too much problem. Do you have good websites that offer any free tutorials? That must have been somebody who was reading my mind. Here's a couple of resources that you may want to take a look at. The first one is Powerpivot Pro. This is a commercial site. I have absolutely no link to that site. They don't know who I am, but I found that they have two training. They have a couple books, and they have a couple online trainings. One online training for the Get and Transform, and the other online training for the Powerpivot. And they have also two books. I read their books. I have done the data model training, and that actually was the significant portion of my own training using their resources. They also have a blog. These guys are pretty good. I like them a lot. There's also some basic introductions to Get and Transform on the Microsoft sites. Any Google of training can get you to places, but I like the Powerpivot Pro itself. We had a question of what's your favorite feature of Excel? I'm not absolutely certain. I think that in the arena of data and data analytics for the last 7 years, in my work when I was a CFO, there was not a single day that didn't go by that I didn't utilize that functionality in some way, shape, or form. So I think the greatest feature in the work that Microsoft has been doing, expanding and increasing the capacity inside of Excel to do data and data analytics is my favorite. And I guess that means we're out of time for today. So I would like to remind everybody that we'll be meeting again next week, that we will be talking about data models, and we're going to be starting to look at what I believe is the really cool stuff. So hopefully you'll join me again next week. You found this to be helpful and enlightening, and get out there and start playing. If you're a geek like me, you'll love it. So thank you, everybody, for your time, and you guys have a great day, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week. Take care now. Bye.